Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
I can still picture every detail of that crisp autumn afternoon when I turned my old sedan into the driveway of my daughter Emily's house on the outskirts of our quiet Cleveland suburb. The kind of neighborhood where maple trees line the streets with leaves blazing in shades of fiery red and burnt orange that always reminded me of the homemade apple pies we'd bake together during her childhood weekends. Those simple rituals that seemed unbreakable until the weight of adult lives and unspoken grudges began to erode them over the years following my husband Tom's sudden death from a heart attack 2 years earlier, leaving me to navigate the remnants of our family on my own while clinging to these Sunday lunches as a fragile thread connecting us all. The air carried the comforting aroma of roasting turkey mingled with fresh sage drifting from the slightly ajar kitchen windows, stirring a hopeful flutter in my chest as I gathered the foil-wrapped casserole I'd prepared that morning, telling myself that despite the subtle tensions I'd sensed in recent phone calls, Emily's clipped responses about her job at the bank, and her husband Mark's latest real estate ventures, this gathering would restore some semblance of the normalcy we'd lost since Tom's passing, when grief had scattered everyone into their private corners of resentment and survival. Emily, my 32-year-old daughter with her practical bob haircut framing a face that mirrored my own in its determined set, but hardened by years of corporate ladders and marital compromises, opened the door with a smile that faltered just enough at the edges to send a quiet warning through me, while Mark lingered in the hallway behind her, his fingers absently scrolling through his phone as if the world outside his screen held no immediate claims. And my younger son Jake, 28 and steadily building his career as a mechanic at the local garage, called out a casual wave from the living room where he lounged on the overstuffed couch, half engaged with a football game flickering on their massive flat-screen television that they'd splurged on last Christmas with money from my savings, a fact I'd never thrown in their faces until that moment began to unfold. We migrated to the dining room table soon after, where the spread unfolded like a tableau from one of those family-oriented magazines that promised harmony in every perfectly plated dish: creamy mashed potatoes flecked with butter, vibrant green beans simmered with bacon bits, and the centerpiece pot roast that Emily had mastered through trial and error, replicating her grandmother's recipe with a precision that always made me swell with quiet pride, even as I noted how these meals had become less about nourishment and more about performing the roles we'd assigned ourselves in this post-Tom era, where I played the steadfast matriarch funding extras from my widow's pension and part-time shifts at the community library, while Emily and Mark navigated their upscale life with the subtle undercurrents of financial strain they masked behind polished facades. The conversation meandered innocently at first through the familiar rhythms of small talk, dissecting the Cleveland Browns' latest disappointing loss with Jake's animated gestures and Mark's sarcastic quips that carried an edge sharper than usual, prompting me to pass the gravy boat with a light comment about how football disappointments paled compared to the real tackles life threw our way. Like the overtime I'd logged at the auto parts store back when Tom was still with us to keep the lights on during lean months, a history Emily knew well, but seemed to gloss over as she served portions with mechanical efficiency, her glances toward me growing increasingly distant, as if she were appraising a stranger rather than the woman who'd sewn her prom dress from thrift store patterns and driven through blizzards for school events. Then, as the meal progressed and the clink of silverware against china provided a deceptive backdrop of domesticity, Mark interjected with remarks laced with implication, musing aloud about how some people and families just consume resources without contributing their fair share, his eyes locking onto mine with a calculated intensity that made the room's warmth feel suddenly oppressive, the floral wallpaper, chosen by his overbearing mother during one of her unsolicited decorating interventions, seeming to close in like witnesses to an impending trial. Before I could redirect the dialogue towards safer territories, such as inquiring about Emily's recent performance review at the bank or Jake's promising new client who sounded like he might offer steady work through the winter, she placed her napkin down with a deliberate precision that silenced the ambient chatter, her expression settling into a mask of resolve that chilled me more than the draft from the slightly open window, and in a voice steady yet threaded with the frost of long-nursed grievances, she declared that I no longer belonged to this family and should leave immediately, the words slicing through the air like a knife through the tender slices of roast. Leaving Jake frozen mid-bite with his fork hovering and Mark nodding in smug affirmation, as if this outburst had been rehearsed in their private conversations away from my ears. The shock rooted me to my chair for what felt like an eternity, but was mere seconds, my mind reeling through a torrent of recollections. The feverish nights I'd pace the floor with infant Emily cradled against me, the scraped-together tuition payments for her accounting degree after Tom's accident derailed our steady income. The silent endurance of her decision to marry Mark over the more grounded teacher she'd dated before him, all those invisible labors that had woven the fabric of our lives together, now apparently unraveled by whatever poison he'd poured into her doubts about my role in their world. Amid the suspended hush broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator, something within me shifted from stunned paralysis to a steely clarity forged in the fires of too many overlooked sacrifices. And rising slowly with my purse clutched like an anchor, I met her gaze and responded that she should remember this exact date because in rejecting me, she hadn't merely severed a maternal bond but had irreparably sabotaged the very foundation of her own prospects, my tone measured and resonant with the weight of unspoken truths that hung between us like the steam rising from untouched plates. I departed without further exchange, the screen door's resounding slam echoing my resolve as I navigated the driveway lined with neighbors' Halloween decorations already peeking from garages, the drive home blurring into a haze of replayed dialogue and the persistent churn in my stomach from the uneaten meal that now symbolized the indigestion of betrayal, arriving at my modest ranch-style home. The one Tom and I had mortgaged our youth to own and pay off through relentless effort to find solace in the familiar creak of floorboards and the faint scent of lavender from the sachets I'd tucked into drawers years ago. Rather than dissolve into tears or futile calls for reconciliation, I poured a modest glass of the inexpensive Merlot reserved for solitary evenings and settled into the worn recliner that still bore the imprint of Tom's frame, allowing the quiet to envelop me while I retrieved the dusty file box labeled Family Matters in his meticulous script from the hallway closet. Its contents a repository of our shared history from mortgage statements to faded snapshots of vacations at the lakeside cabin we'd sold under duress. As I delved into the papers illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp, my fingers brushed against an aged envelope sealed with brittle tape and inscribed in a lawyer's formal hand from 15 years prior, its presence evoking a cascade of buried memories that could dismantle the sanitized version of our past Emily clung to, prompting a subtle curve to my lips, not born of malice yet, but of the empowering realization that control lingered in unexpected places. With deliberate calm, I accessed the online portal for the joint family account I'd established post-Tom's death as a safety net for emergencies, methodically revoking Mark's privileges in a transaction traceless and swift, a preliminary assertion of boundaries that whispered of retaliations yet to come, all while the twilight deepened outside, casting elongated shadows that mirrored the uncertainties ahead, for in that envelope lay the potential to reshape alliances and expose fractures none of them anticipated, leaving me poised on the brink of revelations that would test the limits of loyalty and regret in ways that promised to linger long after the echoes of that Sunday faded. Those initial days following the explosive unraveling at Emily's dining table stretched out before me like an endless stretch of gray highway under a overcast Ohio sky, where every hour blended into the next with a monotonous rhythm broken only by the sporadic chime of the doorbell from neighbors dropping off sympathetic casseroles they pretended weren't prompted by the neighborhood grapevine's swift whispers about the Jenkins family drama that had escalated faster than a summer thunderstorm. I found myself wandering the rooms of my ranch-style home in threadbare sweatpants that carried the faint scent of laundry detergent mixed with the isolation I'd wrapped around myself like an unwelcome cocoon, brewing pot after pot of strong coffee in the mornings to chase away the fog of sleepless nights, replayed with Emily's cutting words echoing against the walls adorned with framed photos of happier gatherings, those snapshots capturing Tom grinning beside a teenage Emily at her high school Graduation or Jake's first fishing trip where he'd hooked nothing but weeds and laughter. Reminders of the cohesion we'd once maintained through sheer determination after Tom's heart attack had upended our world 2 years prior, forcing me into double shifts at the library and the auto parts store to keep the roof over our heads while the kids navigated their paths into adulthood with varying degrees of grace and ingratitude. By the third afternoon, as the leaves outside swirled in erratic patterns driven by a brisk wind that rattled the window panes, Jake appeared at my door unannounced with his toolbox still slung over one shoulder from a long day at the garage, his face etched with the kind of concern that mirrored his father's practical worry during family crises like the time our old station wagon broke down en route to a lake vacation, prompting him to envelop me in a bear hug that smelled of motor oil and unspoken loyalty before guiding me to the kitchen table where we settled, with mugs of steaming brew that allowed the conversation to flow gradually from surface pleasantries about his latest repair job on a finicky transmission to the heart of the matter, his admission that he'd caught snippets of Mark's venomous commentary during the drive back from the lunch, labeling me a burdensome drain on family resources when the truth stood starkly opposite with my contributions to their wedding fund and Emily's down payment on that starter home 5 years back, sacrifices I'd made without fanfare to preserve the illusion of stability in our suburban enclave. Jake's support came laced with cautionary notes as he stirred sugar into his coffee with deliberate circles, urging me to reach out to Emily before the rift calcified into something irreparable like the frost heaves that buckled neighborhood driveways each winter, his words drawing me into a reluctant recounting of the deeper fissures that had likely fueled her outburst, flashbacks surfacing unbidden to those strained months immediately after Tom's funeral when grief had amplified every minor inequity in my eyes, leading me to pour extra hours into Jake's vocational training at the community college mechanics program to steer him clear of the aimless drift that claimed some of his friends. A choice born not from favoritism, but from the raw pragmatism of a widow assessing survival odds in a world that offered no second chances. Though Emily had internalized it as deliberate neglect amid her own burgeoning career pressures at the bank where promotions dangled like elusive carrots. We shared a moment of levity amid the heaviness when I quipped about Mark's overinflated ego resembling a balloon at one of those county fair games ready to pop under the slightest prick, Jake chuckling softly as he recalled how Mark had once tried to fix our old lawnmower during a family barbecue only to make it sputter worse than before, highlighting the man's penchant for superficial solutions that masked his deeper insecurities about financial footing in their upscale lifestyle funded partly by my quiet infusions from the trust I'd nurtured since selling the lakeside cabin under duress years earlier. As Jake departed with promises of daily check-ins and a leftover slice of pie I'd baked absent-mindedly that morning, the solitude reclaimed me with renewed force, propelling me toward a proactive step as I dialed Rita, my lawyer friend whose office downtown buzzed with the organized chaos of file cabinets and ringing phones, meeting her later that week over a spread of day-old donuts that tasted triumphantly stale as we pored over documents in her cluttered conference room, her sharp eyes scanning my directives to amend the will by bolstering Jake's inheritance share from the trust fund while inserting clauses that would compel Emily to confront her past indiscretions before accessing hers, all woven with humorous asides about those darn fool in-laws of Mark's from Akron who meddled like they owned stock in family discord, their unsolicited advice during holidays always veering toward how I should move on from widowhood by downsizing my life to fit their narrow visions. The isolation gnawed deeper by the fifth day, manifesting in drives to the local grocery store where I navigated aisles stocked with impulse buys that tempted forgotten indulgences, overhearing clusters of women in the bakery section commiserating over their own tales of daughter-in-law tensions and ungrateful offspring who viewed parental support as an entitlement rather than a gift, their stories weaving a tapestry of shared suburban struggles that eased the sting of my own predicament just enough to fuel a spark of resolve as I loaded my cart with comfort staples like canned soup and fresh bread, returning home to immerse myself further in the file box's revelations that illuminated how Emily's long-simmering resentment had taken root in those post-Tom years when my focus on Jake's stability, arranging apprenticeships and covering tool costs, had left her feeling sidelined during her early banking gigs, a perception exacerbated by Mark's whispers of inequity that twisted my protective instincts into accusations of bias, all while ignoring the broader canvas of my efforts to shield them both from the fallout of her youthful financial missteps during college that I'd buried deep to preserve her unblemished record. That evening, as twilight painted the living room in muted blues and the distant hum of evening traffic provided a lulling underscore, I executed my second measure of retribution with calculated anonymity. Composing an email from a disposable address to a former colleague of Mark's I'd encountered at Emily's office holiday party, a realtor with a nose for ethical lapses, who I'd once assisted by recommending clients during a slow season, detailing the nuances of Mark's off-the-books property. Flips that skirted tax obligations without crossing into outright fraud, but sufficient to erode investor confidence and plant seeds of scrutiny in professional circles. Hitting send with a mix of vindication and fleeting remorse that this clever undermining might ripple back to Emily's doorstep in ways that tested her loyalties anew. The fragile peace shattered on the 8th evening when my landline rang with Mark's number illuminating the caller ID like a harbinger of confrontation. His voice slithering through the receiver with a blend of aggression and false civility as he demanded explanations for the frozen family account access and warned of impending legal repercussions if I persisted in what he termed my vindictive games. His threats laced with the bluster of a man unaccustomed to pushback in his carefully curated world of handshakes and house showings. Leaning against the kitchen counter with the cord twisted around my fingers, I allowed a measured pause before responding that his bluster rang hollow given my awareness of his clandestine afternoons spent with the receptionist from his brokerage firm. Details gleaned from a casual mention Emily had let slip during a late-night call months prior amid her venting about work stresses, my revelation striking with the precision of a well-placed countermove. That left him stammering into stunned silence before the line went dead, plunging the house back into quietude where I stood unmoving, the weight of impending escalation settling over me like the gathering clouds outside. For encountering his advance with this intimate knowledge, I'd not only defended my ground, but ignited a fuse that promised to illuminate shadows none of us could fully evade. Precisely 10 days after the devastating confrontation that had shattered the fragile veneer of our family gatherings around that ill-fated Sunday table, where Emily's icy declaration had severed ties I'd spent decades nurturing through sleepless nights and selfless decisions, I found myself immersed in the mundane rhythm of household chores on that overcast afternoon in my Cleveland suburb home, folding stacks of laundry in the living room with the television murmuring a home renovation program that showcased transformations of outdated kitchens into sleek modern havens. An ironic backdrop to my own stagnant life, marked by the persistent ache of isolation since Tom's untimely heart attack 2 years earlier had left me as the sole custodian of our shared memories and the burdens they carried. The sunlight filtered weakly through half-drawn blinds, casting elongated patterns across the carpet worn thin from years of pacing during family crises like the time Emily's college tuition shortfall had forced me to dip into emergency savings without complaint, illuminating dust particles that danced lazily in the air much like the unresolved questions swirling in my mind about what fresh manipulations Mark might have woven into Emily's perceptions to justify her banishment, prompting me to pause mid-fold with a worn towel clutched in my hands as the insistent ring of my cell phone pierced the quiet, its screen displaying Emily's name in a glow that stirred a turbulent mix of anticipation and wariness within me, for in the intervening silence she'd maintained radio contact while I navigated the emotional minefield of Jake's supportive visits and Rita's legal counsel on safeguarding the trust fund's intricacies. Answering with a steady voice that belied the flutter in my chest reminiscent of the anxiety before Tom's surgery consultations, I listened as her sobs erupted through the line in jagged waves that echoed the vulnerability she'd last displayed during her high school breakup over a betrayal that paled in comparison to the marital fractures now threatening her world, her pleas tumbling forth in a torrent of remorse where she confessed how Mark's embellished tales of my supposed financial greed portraying me as a secretive hoarder siphoning inheritance meant for their envisioned family expansions, had clouded her judgment amid the mounting pressures of her precarious position at the bank following recent departmental restructurings that left her questioning the stability of the life she'd constructed on foundations partly laid by my overlooked contributions like the wedding fund I'd amassed through overtime shifts at the library. As her words poured out amid hiccuping breaths that painted vivid pictures of escalating domestic arguments culminating in slammed doors and accusations that exposed Mark's controlling tendencies disguised as protective guidance, I settled onto the edge of the couch with the phone pressed close, allowing the narrative to unfold without interruption while subtle clues from our shared history resurfaced in my thoughts, such as the old envelope upstairs containing documents from her college era that could illuminate why our family finances had suffered unexplained dips I'd covered silently to avert scandal and preserve her promising trajectory in accounting. A maternal shield that now seemed to underscore the irony of her viewing me as the antagonist in this unfolding drama. The conversation veered into territory laced with bitter humor when I interjected with a dry observation about life's penchant for scripting reversals akin to those plot twists in the afternoon soaps Emily used to mock during our rare mother-daughter brunches, prompting a watery chuckle from her that briefly lightened the weight of her admissions regarding Mark's inconsistencies, like his insistence on lavish date nights funded by questionable real estate side deals while critiquing my frugal widowhood as miserly rather than resilient. Building on the momentum of her vulnerability, I disclosed a pivotal twist by mentioning the private investigator I'd engaged on Rita's recommendation mere days after the lunch debacle, a precautionary measure to document any encroachments on the family account that had unexpectedly unearthed irrefutable evidence of Mark's infidelity, complete with timelines of midday rendezvous at nondescript motels and gifts exchanged with his office receptionist whose Instagram posts flaunted luxuries incompatible with a modest salary, details that aligned chillingly with Emily's offhand complaints during a previous late-night call about his extended client meetings that now revealed themselves as deceptions eroding the trust she'd invested in their partnership. Her stunned silence stretched across the connection like a taut wire humming with shock, allowing me to elaborate with a touch of wry amusement on the investigator's report that read like a poorly concealed affair novel, emphasizing how such discoveries often surfaced when one peeled back the layers of suburban facades where neighbors waved politely over fences while harboring secrets as commonplace as the overpriced coffee at the corner bistro, a revelation that not only validated my earlier anonymous tip to his associate, but positioned me as the reluctant bearer of truths she'd been too entangled to perceive amid her career anxieties and the facade of marital bliss. In a maneuver of calculated retribution that blended serendipity with intent, I referenced an email chain from the investigator inadvertently forwarded to her professional inbox under the pretext of a benign family update attachment, its contents detailing the affair's chronology and implications with clinical precision. That ensured circulation through her bank's tight-knit grapevine where gossip flowed as freely as interoffice memos, a subtle sabotage designed to undermine Mark's credibility without direct accusation, satisfying in its elegance like a chess grandmaster's unforeseen check that forced the opponent to reassess their entire strategy while sparing me the messiness of confrontation. Emily's response escalated the tension as her voice rose from incredulity to a fractured demand for the evidence's origin and my precise knowledge of these betrayals that now imperiled not just her marriage, but her professional poise in an environment where personal scandals could ripple into performance reviews, her questions probing the depths of my involvement and the motivations behind withholding this bombshell until her plea shattered the standoff, yet I parried with measured restraint, proposing an in-person dialogue once she'd disentangled herself from the immediate fallout to confront the realities I'd long suspected but chosen to monitor from afar. The call concluded in abrupt disconnection as her composure fractured into another wave of tears that trailed off into the void of the dial tone, leaving me to replace the receiver with deliberate slowness amid the living room's subdued lighting where the television droned on about seamless cabinet installations oblivious to the real renovations underway in my family's fractured dynamics, A faint smile touching my lips as I glanced toward the staircase leading to the envelope's hiding place. Its revelations poised to further dismantle the narratives Emily had clung to for protection, while the encroaching dusk outside mirrored the uncertainties that bound us in this web of half-truths and impending reckonings. For in unveiling Mark's duplicity through this orchestrated exposure, I'd not only exacted a measure of justice for her disownment, but ignited a chain reaction that teetered on the edge of redemption or deeper division, with her final shocked query lingering in the air like an unanswered summons to the heart of our shared deceptions. Just 2 days after that emotionally charged phone conversation where Emily's sobs had pierced through the line like shards of the family crystal we'd shattered over the years with accumulated resentments and half-buried secrets, she materialized on my doorstep in the late afternoon haze of another overcast Cleveland day, her usually impeccable bob haircut disheveled as if she'd run her hands through it repeatedly during the drive from her bank job that now hung in precarious limbo amid the whispers of Mark's scandal rippling through professional networks I'd subtly amplified with my forwarded revelations. The scent of rain-dampened earth mingled with the vanilla notes of her signature perfume as she crossed the threshold without awaiting an invitation. Her coat draped loosely over one arm revealing the rumpled blouse beneath that spoke volumes about sleepless nights tangled in arguments and self-doubt since learning of Mark's betrayals, while I stood momentarily frozen in the entryway, with a dish towel slung over my shoulder from wiping down the kitchen counters where I'd prepared a simple lasagna more for the comfort of routine than any expectation of company. The aroma wafting invitingly yet underscoring the awkward domesticity of this unannounced intrusion into my solitary routine shaped by widowhood's quiet demands since Tom's heart gave out 2 years prior. We lingered in that confined space amid the framed mementos lining the walls, photos of Emily's wedding where I'd footed the bill without a murmur and Jake's graduation grin that masked his early struggles, before migrating to the living room where she collapsed onto the couch with a sigh that carried the weight of her unraveling world, launching immediately into a halting apology laced with justifications about how the stresses of impending layoffs at the bank combined with Mark's controlling narratives had blinded her to the cruelty of her Sunday disownment, her eyes pleading for the understanding I'd extended so freely during her teenage rebellions, but now tempered by the sting of betrayal that made forgiveness feel like extending a hand to a thorn vine. As the conversation deepened into the territory of raw admissions, I guided her toward the coffee table where the infamous envelope from 15 years back lay partially unsealed like a Pandora's box I'd hesitated to fully unleash, revealing in measured tones the full extent of her college-era embezzlement from the auto parts stores till those impulsive withdrawals for late-night parties and apartment deposits during her wild sorority phase that had nearly toppled our family's fragile finances. After Tom's accident had already strained our resources to the breaking point, forcing me to liquidate assets quietly, including the beloved lakeside cabin to cover the shortfall and shield her from criminal charges that could have derailed her accounting career before it began. A maternal cover-up born of desperate love that I'd concealed even from Tom to spare him further heartache, though it ultimately contributed to the silent fractures in our marriage that his doctor attributed partly to unmanaged stress. Emily's face strained of color as the details unfolded, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve in a gesture reminiscent of the anxious child who'd once confessed to shoplifting candy only for me to handle the restitution without involving authorities, evoking a complex swirl in me where sympathy for her remorse clashed with the audience's potential disapproval of my enabling choices that perpetuated cycles of secrecy rather than enforcing accountability in our Midwestern ethos of tough lessons learned through consequence. Yet in that moment, watching her grapple with the enormity of my sacrifices, the abandoned bakery dreams deferred to prioritize her stability, I couldn't suppress a wry chuckle at the irony of how her youthful adventures had mirrored Mark's current indiscretions in their disregard for the foundational trust I'd toiled to maintain through library overtime and solo budgeting. The tension thickened further when Jake arrived unexpectedly, having received a cryptic text from Emily en route from the garage with grease still faintly staining his knuckles despite a hasty wash, his presence injecting a mediating influence as he hugged us both before settling into the armchair with a mug of fresh coffee. Confessing his own long-held suspicions about Mark's fidelity gleaned from overheard bar conversations among fellow mechanics who crossed paths with the realtor at local watering holes, a twist that amplified Emily's defensiveness into a heated volley where she accused him of siding with me out of favoritism, only for the ping of incoming emails on her phone to interrupt with notifications from colleagues alluding delicately to personal developments stemming from the affair's exposure that had snowballed into public fodder through the bank's gossip channels, painting Mark as the architect of their joint vulnerabilities. Humor surfaced tentatively amid the storm as we attempted stilted small talk over slices of cooling lasagna at the dining table, my deadpan remark about Mark's heck of a knack for juggling commitments like a circus act gone awry, drawing a reluctant snort from Jake while Emily's forced smile faltered, highlighting the absurdity of discussing neighborhood block parties as if we weren't dissecting the very pillars of her marriage that I'd methodically undermined with anonymous precision. The light vulgarity in my internal frustration bubbling as I thought of the mess they'd woven without regard for the threads I'd mended time and again. As the evening wore on with revelations piling like autumn leaves outside the window, Emily probing why I'd orchestrated the cover-up if my love was so unconditional, my honest retort framing it as the flawed armor of a parent shielding her fledgling from life's harsher judgments. We delved into the trust fund's origins, how I'd rebuilt it incrementally. From side gigs at farmers' markets selling pies that echoed my unrealized bakery aspirations, a nest egg intended as a collective safety net now poisoned by her ingratitude and Mark's manipulations that intertwined with her past mistakes through forged endorsements he'd encouraged during their courtship. In a pinnacle of witty retribution that unfolded seamlessly during this exchange, I retrieved my laptop from the side table and initiated a discreet transfer of a substantial portion to Jake's independent account earmarked for his down payment on a modest home near the garage, articulating it as a prudent allocation under my trusteeship to secure his future amid uncertainties, the on-screen confirmation eliciting Emily's sharp protests that dissolved into stunned silence as the implications dawned, her isolation from this resource forcing a reckoning with the consequences of her choices without a single accusatory word from me, a clever maneuver satisfying in its passive finality like slipping a key out of reach during a heated game of hide-and-seek. The visit extended into the deepening night with more awkward pauses, filled by offers of seconds on lasagna that no one truly hungered for. Emily's questions circling back to the envelope's deeper contents, where hints of Mark's financial entanglements with her old discrepancies lurked like shadows ready to engulf their union. But as the clock neared 10, she rose abruptly with tears streaking her cheeks, vowing through clenched teeth to consult a lawyer and contest the fund's distribution as rightfully hers despite the legal barriers I'd fortified with Rita's expertise, storming toward the door with a final glare that promised battle lines drawn sharper than before, the slam reverberating through the house like thunder presaging a deluge. Yet as her car lights pierced the darkness down the driveway, I turned to Jake with a steady gaze, murmuring about the envelope's ultimate secret, the evidentiary links binding Mark's recent fudges directly to Emily's concealed thefts that could incinerate their marriage in a blaze of legal scrutiny if she pursued litigation aggressively, leaving the air charged with the precarious balance of potential destruction or a forced awakening, the uncertainty coiling tighter as night enveloped the suburb in its quiet vigil. We had settled on meeting at that unassuming diner perched on the fringes of our Cleveland suburb the following morning after Emily's stormy departure from my home the night before, a neutral territory with its faded red booths scarred by decades of locals dissecting everything from job losses to marital woes over plates of hash browns and refills of bottomless coffee that steamed with the promise of clarity amid the chaos that had engulfed our family since the explosive Sunday lunch where her cold rejection had ignited a chain of revelations and retaliations I'd orchestrated with the precision of someone long accustomed to holding the family's fragile equilibrium together following Tom's devastating heart attack 2 years earlier. The place hummed with the low murmur of early patrons, truckers nursing mugs and retirees trading stories about grandkids, as I slid into the booth opposite Emily, who had arrived ahead of me with her eyes shadowed by exhaustion that etched deeper lines into Her face than the vinyl seats bore from years of shifting weights, her fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the laminated menu while the waitress approached with her notepad at the ready. Taking our orders for simple black coffee and eggs over easy in a ritual that mimicked normalcy but underscored the chasm between us, widened by her pleas for reconciliation tangled with demands for the trust fund's release that now represented her desperate grasp at salvaging a life unraveling under Mark's exposed infidelities and financial deceptions I'd methodically unveiled through anonymous tips and forwarded documents. As the coffee arrived in thick ceramic mugs that warmed our hands against the autumn chill seeping through the plate glass windows overlooking a parking lot dotted with rusting pickups, Emily broke the heavy silence with a voice raw from crying jags and confrontations that had consumed the hours since our last exchange, detailing how Mark's empire of real estate deals had crumbled overnight, with clients withdrawing amid the scandals spread through professional circles and his own family's judgmental interventions from their Akron stronghold, where his mother had always viewed our modest Jenkins lineage as beneath their polished aspirations. Her narrative laced with the fresh sting of discovering his affair's deeper entanglements that looped back to her own concealed college embezzlement through endorsements he'd forged during their early romance, a complicity I'd shielded from exposure to protect her budding career at the bank, now teetering on the brink of collapse due to the very ripples of distrust my actions had amplified. I allowed her words to settle like the cream she absent-mindedly stirred into her cup, the steam curling upward in wispy trails that evoked the smoke from the family bonfires we'd once shared at the lakeside cabin before its sale had become the silent cornerstone of my sacrifices. Before responding with the full weight of the envelope's secrets unfurled in deliberate layers that painted the trust fund's origins not as hoarded greed, but as the painstaking reconstruction from the ashes of her youthful thefts from the auto parts store till those frantic grabs for social validation amid sorority pressures and boyfriend debts that had spiraled into thousands, forcing me to mortgage our family home quietly after Tom's accident had already sapped our reserves, liquidating everything including that cherished cabin where we'd forged memories of lazy summers and Tom's laughter echoing over the water to repay the losses without alerting authorities or tarnishing her record, a choice steeped in the fierce maternal instinct that prioritized her future over my own dreams of opening a cozy bakery filled with the scents of cinnamon rolls and fresh bread that I deferred indefinitely to stitch our lives back together. Emily's composure fractured as the enormity sank in, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks while she grasped how my warning that fateful Sunday hadn't been empty spite, but a prophetic echo of the destruction she'd courted by dismissing the invisible scaffolding I'd erected through widows' pensions and library shifts that masked the erosion of my personal aspirations, her pleas shifting from indignant claims on the inheritance to heartfelt appeals for its partial release to fund her nascent catering business idea, a venture she'd floated during brighter days as a path to independence from Mark's domineering shadow, that now symbolized her bid to reclaim agency amid the fallout where his lies had intertwined with her past to forge chains she hadn't fully recognized. Until my revelations cracked them open, the audience might wrestle with the morality of my long-held silence, viewing it as a flawed enabling that perpetuated the very cycles of deception plaguing our Midwestern family tableau rather than imposing the tough love accountability that defines so many suburban redemption arcs. Yet, in the diner's fluorescent glow reflecting off the checkered floor, I couldn't deny the pang of sorrow mingling with vindication as I watched her confront the human cost of my choices, the strained final years with Tom, where unspoken financial burdens contributed to the stress his doctor cited in the autopsy report, leaving me to ponder aloud if love's protective veil sometimes blurs into the very destruction it seeks to avert. A flicker of humor pierced the gravity when I recounted with dry understatement the lawyer's bemused reaction upon learning the full scope years ago, his eyebrow arching at the heck of a convoluted family tapestry we'd woven through layers of forgeries and cover-ups that rivaled the plot lines of those evening dramas Emily once binge-watched during college breaks, eliciting a choked laugh from her that briefly thawed the booth's tension before I unveiled the culminating act of retribution in the form of a crisp document slid across the Formica tabletop, outlining conditional access to a portion of the fund contingent upon her public denunciation of Mark's manipulations, the affair's sordid timeline, the tax-skirting deals, the forged ties to her old discrepancies, to his in-laws, and the banking oversight board where her testimony could shield her position while dismantling his facade entirely. A witty delegation of the final blow that empowered her agency without absolving my role in. The orchestration, satisfying in its strategic elegance like a card player laying down a trump that reshapes the game's board while leaving the opponent to fold or fight on altered terms. She stared at the papers with trembling hands as the diner's clock ticked inexorably toward noon. The conflict etching turmoil across her features in a tableau of indecision, where the allure of financial reprieve warred with the guilt of betraying the man she'd vowed to despite his transgressions. Her questions probing the boundaries of my forgiveness and the potential for rebuilding from these ruins, yet I held firm with an honest gaze that conveyed the ambiguity of true reconciliation, whether this ultimatum served as a bridge to mutual understanding or a barrier reinforcing the isolation her words had wrought, while the waitress refilled our cups with oblivious efficiency. The clink of porcelain punctuating the unspoken crossroads where our paths diverged further into uncharted territory. Rising to depart with the bill settled and my heart burdened by a cocktail of resolve and regret heavier than the chill wind awaiting outside, I paused at the door as Emily's renewed sobs echoed softly behind me. The parking lot's gravel crunching underfoot like the fragments of our fractured bonds as I drove away into the strengthening sunlight that pierced the clouds with hesitant optimism. The rearview mirror reflecting not just the diner's neon sign, but the lingering enigma of whether she'd embrace the exposure to forge a self-reliant future or succumb to the pull of old loyalties, leaving me to navigate the open road alone with questions that promised no tidy answers, but an enduring meditation on the delicate interplay of sacrifice, retribution, and the elusive possibility of healing in a family forever altered by the echoes of that shattering Sunday.